Law School. And I'd like to welcome you to our Teaching Justice webinar series and our session today, which is Teaching Transformative Hope to Advance Social Change, featuring Gulika Reddy, from Stanford Law. We are so excited to have her join us today.
Hey everyone, I'm Layla Halas. I'm an associate professor of law here at Tulane Law School and co-director of our immigrant rights clinic. And as Allison said, we're really thrilled to have you here today for another session of CLIA's Teaching Justice webinar series, which is a project of our Best Practices in Pedagogy Committee. And we've been really thrilled to have so many innovative clinical faculty members talking about different ways of teaching justice in the classroom. We have more to come this semester, and the registration information is on our website. We also invite you to stay tuned on the listservs, and we will be circulating those links for our future sessions as well.
Great. I'm happy to get started, and thank you, Allison and Lila, for organizing this, and thank you everyone for making the time to join us. Mentioning to Allison just before this, I know that everyone has a million things on their plate right now, so I really appreciate people making the time. I'm gonna share my screen, but if people are not able to view it, just unmute yourselves and let me know. And apologies in advance for sounding like I have a congestion, or if I cough, I'm in recovering from a flu right now. And yeah, just so I see Conrad's face in the group, and it's, yeah, just so special to see lots of names and faces who have joined today who all mean a lot to me. So thank you so much. And so for those of you who don't know me, I'm a human rights advocate from India, and I direct the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic at Stanford. And our clinic has worked on human rights issues around the world, including in Uganda, Jamaica, Liberia, India, Kashmir, Pakistan, El Salvador, Colombia, Panama, and the United States. And in terms of our thematic focus, we've worked on a range of issues, but the four broad buckets of rights that we work on involve identity-based harms. We've focused primarily on issues related to sexuality, gender, and race, human rights issues in conflict, migration, as well as the climate crisis. And as you can imagine, this work is incredibly rewarding and meaningful, but there are moments, including this past month, that it feels like you've taken one step forward and then two steps back. And in moments like these, human rights advocates have expressed feeling overwhelmed, either about the scale and complexity of the challenge, as well as the uncertainty about a possible path forward. And often students have come to office hours and asked, is there any point in entering the public interest field? And I think what's underlying that question often is change possible? And hope is a really important attitude and orientation in moments of doubt and uncertainty, because what it can do is it can create a sense of possibility about the future and make us believe that our actions will result in meaningful change. And it's also an orientation or a practice that can help justify commitment, action, and creative problem solving. And while I knew that hope is valuable for human rights work, I think what I was less sure of, which led me to write an article about this topic, is what form of hope does the human rights field need? Because what I found is that not all forms of hope are helpful, and in fact, some are misguided or even dangerous. And others could manipulate the language of hope, and some even helpful forms of hope may not go far enough. Another question I had was, is hope a skill or practice that advocates can cultivate, and that institutions and classrooms can meaningfully foster as a skill. And finally, how can we as advocates sustain hope through the inevitable setbacks that we're likely to face in our practice? And to address these questions, the article does a few things. First is there wasn't much scholarship, legal scholarship on hope. So it draws on scholarship across a range of different disciplines to create a novel typology of key forms of hope. And I argue that transformative hope is a form of hope that the human rights field needs. It then describes how we might cultivate this form of hope and how we can sustain transformative hope. And finally, the article concludes with, sharing that although the piece is focused on the human rights field, I think that some of the insights and lessons can apply more broadly to the social justice field, and leaves the reader with questions that they can reflect on to think about how it might apply to other fields in the social justice space. But before moving forward, I was left with this question of what is hope? I think hope is something we use in our day-to-day conversations. We can hope to get a parking spot not 15 blocks away from where we're going, or hope to not get caught in the rain without an umbrella. But we can also hope that, as a field, we're able to face and address some of the challenges that we experience. And although it was a word that sort of comes up in daily conversation, the term felt quite abstract, and it's actually been defined quite differently in the literature. So it's been defined as an emotion, as a personality disposition or trait. It's been described as either biological, it's been described as being a social construct. And finally, it has also been described as a learned practice or skill. And I think that was the one that resonated with me, because if it is a learned practice or mindset or skill, then it's something that institutions and teachers can intentionally cultivate, teach, and model for students and staff working in their organization. And although there are varying definitions of what hope is, there were two elements of hope that really stood out as true or effective forms of hope in the literature. So one is hope as being active rather than passive. And then the second is hope being grounded in material conditions rather than being disconnected from the realities of impacted communities. And depending on the extent to which different forms of hope embraced these two dimensions, I found that it resulted in quite a different degree of effectiveness of hope. And in workshopping this with other advocates and clinical instructors, they found that having a typology like this helps them visualize, situate, and then shift where they lie on the table, and shift both their mindset and practice to move to more constructive forms of hope. So I'll start with false hope. And false hope is at the intersection of being ungrounded and passive. So just imagine, an ostrich who buries their head in the sand and is like, don't worry, everything is going to be fine. So it's sort of optimistic, wishful thinking, but neither is there action nor is it rooted in reality. So if we think of some of the, big human rights victories that we've had, whether it's, say, the end of apartheid in South Africa, that involved unrelenting action. So being passive is insufficient to effect change. And then the second, an example of being ungrounded is thinking, for example, when Obama won the election for the first time, thinking that's the end of racism in the United States. And again, that is being disconnected from the systemic realities of racism in this country. The second is latent hope, which is at the intersection of being grounded and passive. So here you might begin to engage with issues. You may read the news, you may engage with communities that are facing these challenges, but you remain passive. And I think there are different ways to think about it. Some might see it as complacency or apathy, which might be the case. But I think on that same spectrum is also what many of my students have described, which is a sense of stuckness. So, sometimes we teach critiques of the human rights field and students share, we get that there are these critiques, but does that mean we shouldn't engage at all? Or how can we engage in a way that is thoughtful? So it's important to talk about the problems and critiques, but also give them the tools to act. And similarly, educators have talked about, how if we share the burden of knowledge of issues with students, that's unfair unless we also give them the tools to take action to address some of those issues. So the good news with latent hope is, in order to move from latent hope to a more constructive form of hope, if you give people the tools to act, there's a possibility of being able to do that. And then at the intersection of active and ungrounded, there are two dimensions of hope. There's reckless hope and disingenuous hope. And the way I distinguish these two hopes is intent. So reckless hope could be jumping in and taking action without really having a grounding in reality or understanding of community needs. And the intent might not be to deliberately manipulate knowledge, which is the case with disingenuous hope. So I can share some examples here. And the human rights field, there are many examples of reckless hope, of advocates parachuting into a context without understanding what is needed, taking action, and that actually causing more harm than good. So for example, in one of the regions that I work in that's impacted by conflict, there were examples of advocates from the global north entering, putting out a report, naming some of the people that they interviewed, and that led to those people being arrested, detained, tortured. And that's an example of acting without the necessary preparedness. Disingenuous hope, on the other hand, we often see politicians employ this form of hope where they say, make promises of economic progress or national security, but at the cost of already marginalized communities. Measured hope is then at the intersection of being both grounded and active. And this manifests as somebody doing a careful survey of the evidence and then developing an intervention based on what is likely to succeed. And although this is valuable, and it's valuable to have interventions of this nature, where measured hope doesn't go far enough is because it's limited to taking action based on the evidence. It doesn't take on action where we may not succeed or where there isn't a clear pathway to success. And this is the key difference between measured hope and transformative hope, and the differences with respect to their relationship with certainty and risk taking. And I'll explain transformative hope next. And transformative hope, what it does is it extends beyond the typology. So it is active and grounded, but it adds the dimensions of imagination and creativity. And what it allows advocates to do is employ their imagination and creativity to take action despite existing constraints, despite existing evidence, and even in the absence of a clear roadmap. And as you'll see in this table, it's not an exclusion of measured hope, which I do think is important, but instead it's an expansion of measured hope. So it could involve goals and approaches based on measured hope, but it's not limited to that. So let's take the example of addressing gender-based violence. Measured hope might look at the past and see what has worked and say, okay, let's set up hotlines, let's represent clients in terms of direct representation. But transformative hope might say, yes, let's take on those accountability measures, but let's extend beyond that and think about how might we shift attitudes or upend power structures that contribute to this form of identity-based harm to begin with. And I think both measured hope and transformative hope are important, and they can meaningfully coexist in the human rights ecosystem. But the reason I focus on transformative hope in this article is, one, because it already contains measured hope, but two, the human rights field currently incentivizes measured hope, sometimes at the expense of transformative hope. So institutions and funders often incentivize interventions where you're able to offer clarity regarding success, But unfortunately, measured hope alone doesn't have the capacity to move us from the world that we're in to the world that we want to be in. And therefore, it's important to be able to engage in transformative hope as well to address the scale and complexity of human rights challenges that we face. So, we might agree that it's not very controversial that hope is valuable, but I think the next question that I was left with was, but then how do we cultivate it? How do we teach it as a skill or practice the way we teach interviewing or fact finding or any other skill that we teach in a clinic? And I think in order to cultivate transformative hope, it's important to meet three interrelated goals. One is to equip individuals with grounded knowledge. The second is to create spaces where they feel empowered to act. And finally, to foster the capacities of imagination and creativity which advocates need when they encounter inevitable roadblocks in the work. And what do I mean by grounded knowledge? I think grounded knowledge has two elements, one material knowledge and the second agentic knowledge. Material knowledge is sort of what we think about when we think about law school, which is knowledge of the law, knowledge of skills, knowledge of tools that you need to take to effect change. And it's important to think about knowledge, not just of the law, but also knowledge of the context in which law is situated. And I think clinics in general are good at sharing material knowledge in terms of skills and tools and capacities. I think one critique of the human rights field in terms of material knowledge is still whose knowledge is centered. I think in institutions in the global north, often it's Eurocentric or US-centric notions of expertise and knowledge, and it's important to think about how do we center the knowledge of local civil society and impacted communities in the way in which we impart material knowledge. But I think that institutions have begun to do some of this, and there is reflection on this. I think the second piece, I think, is where people might be doing this, but perhaps not naming it in this way or not being quite as intentional. And it was actually my students that taught me that agentic knowledge is something that we need. And agentic knowledge, I define as knowledge that change is possible. And the human rights field is really good at documenting problems, at exposing human rights abuses, but it's sometimes less good at sharing successes and solutions. And I think if you've been in the human rights field for a while, you've already experienced that success or the solution yourself, so that you might be sort of intrinsically aware of the agentic knowledge. But I think it's important to communicate that to students and staff who are early on in their career. And this example, the value of agentic knowledge became really clear to me a few years ago, where I had a student in the class, and one of the projects that we work on is in Uganda, where there was an anti-homosexuality act that was passed about a year and a half ago, which imposes the death penalty for certain forms of homosexuality. It criminalized the provision of basic essential services. So, for example, it criminalized a doctor providing healthcare to somebody from the LGBT community, or it made it illegal for a landlord to rent an apartment to somebody in the LGBT community, or required parents to report their children if they knew they were in the LGBT community, and if not, they could be criminalized for that. And one of my students on the project shared that he was like, when I thought that it was just the state that was the perpetrator that has passed this bill that was then enacted, I felt like, okay, we can work with our partner organization and challenge the constitutionality of this act in court, which is what they were doing. But he said, what has made me feel really demoralized is just how much public support the act has. And he asked one of our project partners, who was living in a safe house at that time, what gives you hope? And what allows you to continue doing this work despite all of the public support that it has? And our project partner said, not only do I have hope, but I have lots of it. A similar law was passed 10 years ago. We successfully challenged it in court. And he said, 10 years ago, people were scared to even take to the streets without masks on because of the risks associated with engaging in this advocacy, because promotion of was also criminalized under this act. And he said now people are protesting, people are on TV, people are on the radio, and we've won before and we will win again. And it was just a complete turnaround for the student for the rest of the quarter. And it was just hearing that change is possible and change has happened, and that form of agentic knowledge made all the difference. The only downside of that was this particular student was a fantastic baker. And in the moment of being demoralized, we had lots of like chocolate banana bread and sweet treats coming in. And as soon as this agentic knowledge was passed, all of the sweet treats stopped, which was unfortunate for me, but it was good for the work and good for the student. The second form is action, and there are two dimensions I focus on. One is goals of the action. So it's important to have clear goals, and goals can serve as anchors in the work. And the second is to normalize non-linear progress. So while it is important to share successes, it's also important to share that successes or progress are not linear. There are often, as an LGBT activist shared with us, setbacks actually are often a sign of progress. He shared with us and some of our students that you actually won't experience a setback unless you have made progress, which was just such an thoughtful way to reframe it, even for me. So I think when we share successes, it's important to not just share the final success, but all the challenges and the barriers and the setbacks that people faced along the way. And this advocate also shared that sometimes when we think about progress, it's not just the advancement of rights. Sometimes it's working really, really hard to make sure we don't move backwards. And I think about that a lot in the moment that we're in. I think if we think about the next 4 years as how do we progress in terms of rights, I think we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. But I think it's a huge success if, as a human rights field or social justice field, we work really hard to even make sure there isn't a regression in terms of rights. And the final element in terms of cultivating transformative hope is imagination and creativity. And I think there are three important things to do. One is having a genuine commitment to imagination and creativity. I think the one thing the human rights field is very good at is taking on a lot of buzzwords, whether it's decolonizing or creativity or innovative or interdisciplinary. But I think it's important to move past just being a buzzword and to have a genuine commitment to imagination and creativity. So, if you're asking people for ideas, making sure it's not just a pro forma exercise, but actually acting on those ideas, incentivizing those ideas, and that's what will help generate additional ideas within teams. The second is collaboration, and this is collaboration within teams, across teams, but also across disciplines. I think another critique of the human rights field is that it can be overly legalistic, and it has been important in our work in the clinic and even in my practice before I started teaching in clinics to work with people in other disciplines, whether it's artists or psychologists, psychiatrists, peace building practitioners. There's often so much that you can learn from the ways in which people in other disciplines view issues and address issues. And then finally, time. I think often you can't force a good idea. You can't sort of just generate a good idea without giving yourself time to think about it. And there's a psychologist, Rollo May, who talks about breakthroughs and how it's often when you alternate between intense focus on an issue, but then also taking a break from it, that's when your unconscious mind is able to process issues and generate ideas. And they talk about, why does Einstein say things like, why do I have my best ideas when I'm in the bathroom or when I'm on a walk? Or someone else saying, oh, I went on a run and I suddenly came up with this idea. And it's because of this sort of like alternation between focusing on it and then taking a break from it. And I always laugh when I present this, because I say this, but I think the institutions that we're in rarely give us time. So I had like a 3 or 4 week period to write this between finishing teaching the quarter, getting COVID, and then having the August cycle for journals. And I was doing all this reading on how time will allow us to be creative and produce creative scholarship or engage in creative advocacy. But I was like, but I have this August deadline. I need to get this done. So I think it's important for institutions and structures to actually allow for the time that we need in order to be creative and to employ the imagination the field needs to address the problems that it faces. And the final part of the article is focused on how can we sustain transformative hope. And there are a few things I offer. One is, given the uncertainty and complexity of the work, it's important to create a strong scaffolding. And there's a lot of leadership literature around how do you create psychologically safe work environments. And one thing I argue is that safe is not antithetical to discomfort. So it's important to actually normalize barriers and discomfort. So there's a hope theorist called Snyder who talks about, in the context of very young children, that it's actually important to cultivate what he calls a necessary frustration tolerance for navigating barriers. And he says these barriers actually teach young children that and give them faith in their own capacities to navigate barriers once they do it. So sometimes it's important to sort of allow students or staff to sit with some of that discomfort and just provide a scaffolding for them to be able to do that. And often students have said that actually building the muscle to sit with uncertainty or sit with discomfort has been amongst the most valuable skills that they've been able to learn in the clinic. And I think the other thing is to sort of dispel this idea that everyone has it together and everybody has all the answers. So, I've had one else, for example, come to me in office hours and say, I'm really struggling because I don't know how to think like a lawyer, when in fact there's tons of literature around the self-esteem roller coaster in 1L year. So it's not just that one student, but many students who are struggling, and it's important to normalize that. The second dimension of a strong scaffolding is making sure you have individualized and authentic supervision. So making sure you're supervising students and meeting them where they are at based on their needs and the needs of the project, as well as authentic supervision. So I think it's tough to tell students to take risks and embrace failure if we don't do it ourselves. And I think I'm guilty of this, and the reminder to constantly practice what you preach. So I think it's tough to tell a student not to be a perfectionist when we're operating in that way ourselves. So it's just, being important to be authentic in the ways in which we supervise. The second is creating space for emotion. And I think it's a myth that hope is a feel-good emotion, and I want to kind of dispel that myth. Hope can actually be painful. It can feel like a struggle. So even in this moment, if people are feeling awful, I don't think that hope is the absence of some of those things. In fact, it is moments of despair and challenge that result in hope to begin with. And there are lots of psychologists who have talked about how when you create these forced divisions between positive and negative emotions, it's actually quite misleading. So one of our partners in a conflict context, when a student asked, what gave him hope, he said, I don't think of hope as a constant emotion. Then when there was a huge geopolitical shift and a revocation of hundreds and hundreds of rights in a region, he said, I was in a funk for 3 months, but then I bounced back. And it's important to kind of give yourself space to feel shitty. So again, in this moment, if people are feeling shitty, it's okay. It's normal to feel shitty, in fact. And I think it would be unrealistic to set the standard of constantly feeling good in this moment. And in fact, I think any form of kind of toxic positivity will only lead to additional guilt or shame or pushing yourselves harder that could lead to burnout, which are all already challenges in the human rights field. The third is collective care. So there's a lot of literature around the mental health impacts of doing human rights work. On one end, it could be things like direct exposure to trauma, which can lead to PTSD or depression or burnout. But there are also things like just having a terrible boss or feeling very overworked that can also lead to some of these issues of burnout. And yet there's fairly limited education about it. And I think this is improving, where more and more clinics and human rights institutions are talking about mental health. But I think in addition to having education about it. It's important to mainstream discussions also about what are some of the barriers to committing to collective care and individual care. So, we often have students saying, we don't want institutions just bringing puppies to the law school during finals, or just saying, oh, why don't you go for that extra yoga class? But really thinking about what are the barriers to engaging in collective care. And then the fourth is community. I think for me, community has certainly been amongst the most meaningful sources of hope. And that's why it's really special to be on this call, because many people on this call are a part of that community for me. And a lot of the advocates in this Zoom room are people who have shown me that change is possible. And nearly every advocate I've spoken to about hope has raised community as being central to what has given them hope. And, when we talk about conferences and events, people have often shared it's actually been the informal spaces where we've gotten to chat outside of the panels, outside of the paper discussions, that have given me inspiration and hope. And it's been important, therefore, to intentionally create some of that time and space for community. And the way we do it in our clinic at Stanford is having a day-long retreat at the start of the year, but then on a bi-weekly basis, having community building exercises or moments to connect with community across the quarter. And finally, joy. I think, we talk a lot about having sustainable human rights careers, but I honestly think we're selling ourselves short if we do that. I think it's important to have joyful careers. And I'll never forget one of our partners, again, who works in a conflict-affected context, who shared that, if we're going to work so hard, we might as well also have fun. And we ended one of the days with just sharing music and poetry that was meaningful to many people in the room. And I think my partners have just been a reminder to me that it's important to take the work seriously, but not take ourselves seriously, and to just make sure that even in the challenges that we face, we're able to approach our days with some degree of levity. I remember there was someone who was an activist in a dictatorship authoritarian context. And he was like, yeah, I'm not worried. I'm a Buddhist, and I believe in impermanence and mortality. And all these dictators are going to die someday, which is great, which is fine. So, these issues will be resolved. So whether it's dark humor or some other form of humor, I would encourage people to think about how can we bring joy to our days. And I'll close here by saying that, when I first started writing this article, I half joked, but genuinely wondered, is this really a subject of research, or is this just purely an existential question for me? But I think given that it's something that came up in multiple conversations, project partners and friends and colleagues shared, that it's given multiple people are thinking about it, it's worth engaging in further exploration. And this article attempted to answer two questions. One, what form of hope does the human rights field need? And then two, how can we cultivate and sustain it? And it offered some answers, but the truth is the answers will always be individual and institutional specific. So the article concludes with an appendix with questions which I hope will prompt reflection across different institutions. And just like hope, reflection on its own is not going to create all of the different changes that we need. But just like hope, I think reflection is integral to being able to generate the kind of commitment and action and resilience and creativity and imagination that we do need to be able to affect change. So I'll close here, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts and reflections on how they have been thinking about hope, either in their classrooms or the institutions that they work in, as well as very happy to take questions as well.